Good to talk to you. Thank you for agreeing to do this.
My
And
pleasure.
a bit of background first. My course, Generative AI for Journalists, is a very hands-on approach to looking at what data science might look like after large language models, after generative AI, after the past year that we've seen the rise of applications like ChatGPT and LangChain and Hugging Face getting really popular and OpenAI getting a lot of money and then almost dying and then coming back again. And one of the discussion topics I keep coming back to week after week with my students is how might this change the face of data journalism? And I thought, who better to ask than you regarding this, both because you've done two Red Center courses before, and also because, I mean, you're actively working with data on a day-to-day basis. It's in your job title at the New York Times, weather data editor. But so my four questions ideally just ask you are to prompt you to maybe think out loud a little bit about how you see data journalism work and journalism in general changing in the next few years. So I'll go question by question by question, and then you can take it from there. So the first question is very basically, how would you define machine learning?
I guess I'm a little bit more old school, if we can say a few years ago is old school when it comes to AI and machine learning. I think I would say machine learning is basically the process of in some way teaching a computer, teaching an algorithm to do something that humans could do if you had sort of unlimited time and unlimited staff. I often frame it for people to think of it as, what if you had access to 100 interns who could do exactly what you wanted them to do and research. And they're really, really good at learning and looking for patterns and looking for the patterns that you ask for, but also have no sense of journalism ethics, have no notion of the world per se, but they're still really good at looking for patterns. And so any sort of algorithm that does that is for me machine learning. And practically that's usually means that you're using a data set that you're training on so that those patterns, you can teach those patterns and that the system can recognize them in the future.
Um, just as a little side note, I guess, do you think calling it generative AI has muddled the waters a little bit in terms of machine learning's role in journalism? Has it fundamentally changed? Apple, I know, it makes it a very pointed act to always call anything involving AI machine learning and not AI like the rest of the industry. And in doing so, I think they're making a statement that at the end of the day, machine learning has been in our toolkits for the past 20 years. It's just taken on a greater role in the public eye. Um,
Actually, it's actually interesting. I mean, so I led a team of people who were working on how to use machine learning specifically for journalism. And there's some amazing applications. A very basic version is to say, "Hey, computer, here's 10 documents. These are all loan agreements. Um, here, that's over here. Over here, I have 12 million documents. Go find in that 12 million, go find other documents that look like these, right? And so it's like, so you can, out of a trove of, let's say, the Pandora Papers or something like that, you wanted to find loan agreements that would be hard for you to do in 12 million documents. It might be easier for 100 interns to do, or you could have a computer do it. So that kind of thing. Another example is here are you know thousands of frames of video footage. I want you to find a yellow bike. Anytime you see a yellow bike, here's what a yellow bike looks like. Go find more of those. So again, these pattern sort of things. And there's other things that sort of something that approaches a little bit more of what you were seeing today is a project that we worked on Quartz, where in a previous at Quartz where I used to work, a previous election, looking through Facebook ads, political Facebook ads, just to figure out what topics different candidates were doing advertising about. So looking through, tens of thousands of Facebook ads in a big process to say like, oh, well, Michael Bloomberg at the time when he was running for president, is taking out ads about guns in Texas, and like we
Mhm.
could do that. And that was again looking for patterns, but looking for language patterns in that case. And then at that time, there was generative AI is actually not that new either. I mean, people were using these sort of feedback systems to create things, whether they sometimes there were, simple sentences. I did some of that. That was sort of fun. A lot of art you could see people were taking art and either morphing it into the style of somebody else or just doing really interesting projects. And a lot of those cases, I kind of, at the time, I really put them in separate categories and still really do in a way. Whereas one is you're looking for patterns and you're trying to help you look for something like you would do as a journalist. And another is you're creating something out of whole cloth and it's kind of interesting, but I never found it particularly useful, right?
Mhm.
So now we're entering this area where it's like, wow, this creator thing, this generative thing is getting all this attention. And I don't know, I sort of feel like the old school pattern matching is getting some short shrift. That
Mhm.
said, a project where something is where you're asking a system to look through and find issues in the text of thousands or millions of ads. I would imagine that generative AI systems that you work with and that people are playing with would probably be much better at that today in this way that suddenly we could say, hey, ChatGPT or whatever, some form of that, go in this folder, look at a million of these, and for each file, tell me what the main topic is. And that
Mhm.
might, I can imagine that that might work. And so then you start crossing over into this world where it's using the power of the generative things, the patterns and the systems and the tokens and all of the stuff that are behind it all, and sort of shoehorning it into like getting it to do things for you that you might have wanted to do before. If that's a little bit high level, but I'm imagining this, and I'm seeing it even in projects like one of the ones that maybe you can make reference to this. I don't have it handy,
Mhm.
but there was an AP project recently where and in one of a TV station was using this kind of work to say, hey, go into this press release of an event or this mailbox full of press releases and tell me when the event starts. That's like that would have been hard to do even in the classic machine learning sensibility before. It's like,
Mhm.
yeah, you could look for dates, but like this notion that you could ask it something that's a little bit more nuanced, like fine, there may be several dates in this press release. It could be the date that the press release was sent and the time the event starts and the time that it ends and whatever. And then to
Mhm.
ask it a particular question, like go through all these press releases and spit out in a format I recognize or that I can use the start date for this event. Like that's starting to get the utility there is starting to get interesting to me as
Mhm.
a person who might be looking at a lot of data.
Yeah, that's really I think that's really on point and it's an astute observation. Some people when discussing generative AI, I find I have a tendency to make a distinction between it and older school predictive machine learning models, the classification models, when they're really the same thing. But the difference with generative AI is you're leaning on their ability to understand natural language
Right.
that they get in the ability to predict and write text. And in learning to write text, they begin to learn to understand the text they write. And um, so, with what you're saying, I think something that I've also been finding is that it's easier to come up with classification models for more complex, nebulous topics. And in doing so, you're leaning on the generative AI model in a way that I think rings true with what Stanford has been calling language models. They've been calling them foundation models because you don't have to train them again. You're kind of hoping that they're able to do X task out of the box in a better way than you could ever achieve by training a model from scratch. But really, at the end of the day, to call it generative is maybe a bit of a misnomer because you can totally use it for predictive tasks, like you're saying. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's interesting too that, when we were building models to look for pattern recognition, we were enhancing existing models
Mm-hmm.
to fine tune them and say, okay, well, you're good at sorting animals or flowers or something, but I want you to look for, vehicles or and then you can train it that way. And so that was kind of interesting. I think what's really popping up in sort of the hallucinations and the problems that come with these huge training sets. And I think what's kind of neat about this is that it sort of speaks to the role that that these where the intersection of the classical way of looking through things and pattern matching and then using generative AI or at least the foundational models for helping to do that kind of work. And I mean, one example you could imagine, which would be a classic data cleaning project for a journalist, a data journalist. So you're working with a bunch of data and you're trying to figure out the zip codes for a bunch of addresses, the postal codes in the US for a bunch of addresses, right? And there are services that do this, so this is maybe not a great example, but you could imagine a situation where the machine learning or the ChatGPT or language model or whatnot has enough knowledge in it to be able to answer those questions for you. So you can say, hey, here's a zip code in Minneapolis, maybe
Mm-hmm.
where I used to live. And it accurately says, oh, well, sorry, here's an address in Minneapolis. Here's accurately the zip code for that address. And you could, what's the zip code for City Hall in New York City? It probably has enough information about that to do that. And here's this address. But you could also imagine that in that situation, that anytime you ask for an address in Beverly Hills, California, that it would always come back with 90210. And if you're not aware, in the United States for a long time there was a TV show called Beverly Hills 90210. And you can imagine a situation where no matter what address you give it, even though there might be several postal codes in Beverly Hills, that it always answers 90210. Very confidently it answers that's the answer because the way the model works is it's like, what are the chances that, the probability that 90210 comes after Beverly Hills in pop culture really high. In your data set, maybe it's not accurate. So it's that kind of thing where it's like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
could imagine using these systems and being able to ask them these questions, and then you end up with these pop culture injections that you don't expect, and you might not see because you're just like, well, it seems to have done pretty well
Mm-hmm.
at this project. So I think in the past we may not like if I were training or modifying an existing model to look for yellow bikes instead, I might have a better understanding maybe about what's in there. But now where these models are trained on like the entire world, I think sometimes knowing where those foibles are going to be might be a little trickier and a little
Mm-hmm.
surprising.
For sure, but it also opens up a new space for discussion, I think, at the very least, about if you have a model that does understand pop culture, what new doors does that open in terms of investigations, in terms of data
Yeah,
work?
yeah,
Because that's something that was never available before. And even in my own research as someone who studies narratives, the fact that these models read like a person does it opens up so many doors to scaling literary studies to like the scale of like 10 million books at once. And if you read all 10 million books from a particular perspective, what does that tell you? And so I think in journalism, at least, we're still beginning to explore that space. And so my final question then is what role do you personally see generative AI playing in the media landscape moving forward, or the news media landscape?
so
Just
I
like a
guess,
prediction.
and I think my answer is going to be not very satisfactory here because I
Sure.
don't know. I
Yeah, for
really
sure.
don't know. I
Mhm.
I and personally, I am so I feel like so much of what we do in journalism, if we're doing the kind of journalism I like to do, which is that our currency, especially in a world of misinformation and disinformation, our currency is fact. Our currency is the truth. And again, this is just speaking for myself. That's the world I've lived in since I was, working on a college newspaper, right? Or high school newspaper even. And so the fact that these models don't know what they're doing. They don't. It's like the fact component of it, and which we've been seeing is like these hallucinations and stuff like that. This just makes me it's hard for me personally to get over that, and that may just be a lack of imagination on my part. But so I don't know. I don't know. I think behind the scenes, like the possibilities, like I was saying, where you could say, hey, here's this trove of documents, instead of having to code it in Python and figure out like how I look for this particular thing or get the match the almost the interface of being able to say like, okay, see how many of these loan documents you can find in this, and like phrasing it like, hey, here's what this looks like. I can imagine it being a lot easier just for a journalist who's not a coder to be able to say like, oh, here's a little collection of documents that I want. Here's the documents I want to look through, go. Instead of having to know how to open a Google Colab notebook and code that stuff up. I guess I see initially potential for maybe that being something where it's like easier for journalists to do the kinds of things we were doing back at Quartz, where we were trying to find this pattern matching, that the generative AI interface is useful for that.
Mm,
Um, uh, and so that's kind of the framing I always think of it in. It's sort of like how the tooling for journalists, like how can I help a journalist do their job better? Um, I think there's a lot of people trying to think about where this fits into the world of journalism. And frankly, I've been super curious about seeing what people come up with. I think that thing that I mentioned at the AP, or the AP's effort, and I can't remember the TV station, where you can say, "Hey, go into this document and extract this thing for me," and it does a pretty good job of that, to the degree that then a journalist can look at it and be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I wanna that's an event we might want to go to." Like that kind of thing seems like useful to me. So
mm,
that's what I would say. I would say it probably I hope that it will create an interface for this kind of classification and machine learning sort of searchings through documents and images and stuff easier for journalists to use on the back end in their work, and then having people going through the fact checking process of like, okay, well, was it right? Did we get everything? Probably not. So how do we deal with that? So I don't know if that's how satisfying that is, but that's kind of my guess.
well, I find it very insightful, and thank you very much for your time. No, I appreciate it deeply, and I'm sure the students will too.